I stood at the church's side entrance, clutching the pearl necklace I'd forgotten to give to Madison before the ceremony. My hands trembled as I pushed open the heavy oak door to the bride's preparation room, expecting to find my future daughter-in-law adjusting her veil one last time. Instead, I saw my husband pressed against her, his lips on hers, their bodies tangled in an embrace that made my stomach drop. The world tilted sideways. 28 years of marriage collapsed in that single moment. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Madison's eyes met mine over Robert's shoulder, and instead of shame, I saw something worse: pity. Before I could process what was happening, my son Daniel appeared beside me, his hand gripping my elbow. "Mom, don't be shocked," he whispered, his voice steady and calm. "The truth is even worse. Subscribe and comment where you're watching from." I needed witnesses to whatever nightmare was unfolding. Daniel guided me down the hallway, away from that room, away from the image burned into my retinas. My legs moved automatically, though every step felt like wading through concrete. The wedding was supposed to start in 40 minutes. 200 guests were already seated in the sanctuary, murmuring excitedly about the union they'd come to celebrate. Robert's mother had flown in from Phoenix at great expense. We'd spent $37,000 on this day. The flowers alone cost $4,000. My mind clung to these mundane details because the alternative was madness. Daniel's grip on my arm tightened as we entered a small office near the church library. He locked the door behind us, his face drawn and pale. "Sit down, Mom," he said quietly. I sank into a leather chair that smelled of old books and furniture polish. "Daniel, your father was kissing your fiancée. We need to stop this wedding immediately." He shook his head slowly, pulling up a second chair to face me. "No, Mom, we're not stopping anything. This has to happen exactly as planned." His words made no sense. I studied my son's face, searching for signs of shock or betrayal, but found only grim determination. Daniel was 29 years old, a corporate attorney with a corner office downtown, and a salary that would hit $215,000 this year. He'd always been methodical, calculating every decision with precision, but this was his wedding day. His bride was in another room kissing his father. What calculation could possibly account for that? "You're not making sense," I managed to say, my voice hoarse. "Did you see what I just saw?" Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked directly into my eyes. "I've known about Dad and Madison for 6 months. I set this whole thing up." The room spun. I gripped the armrests of the chair, my knuckles white against the burgundy leather. 6 months. Daniel had known for 6 months that his father and fiancée were having an affair, and he'd continued planning this elaborate wedding anyway. He'd smiled through the engagement party, the cake tasting, the rehearsal dinner just last night where Robert gave a toast about integrity and family values. Why? The question came out as barely a whisper. Daniel stood and walked to the small window overlooking the church parking lot. Cars gleamed in neat rows under the June sunshine. "Because Dad's been stealing from me for 3 years, he said flatly. "From you, too. From the business you helped him build. I needed proof, and I needed leverage. Madison was the key to both. My husband wasn't just unfaithful. He was a thief. The room's walls seemed to close in. I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't cooperate." Robert and I had started his consulting firm together in 1997, working from our basement while Daniel was still in elementary school. I'd managed the books, handled client communications, and sacrificed my own career ambitions to support his dreams. The business now generated $3.2 million annually. We owned the building outright, held 7-figure retirement accounts, and maintained a staff of 14. But Daniel was saying Robert had been stealing from all of it. "How?" I asked, my voice stronger now as anger began cutting through the shock. Daniel turned from the window, his expression hardening. "He's been creating ghost employees, routing their paychecks to offshore accounts, falsifying expense reports, billing clients for work that was never done and pocketing the difference. I started noticing discrepancies last year when I helped with the quarterly tax filings." "And Madison?" The name tasted like poison on my tongue. Daniel's jaw tightened. "I met her at a legal conference in Chicago 14 months ago. She seemed perfect, charming, beautiful, ambitious. We dated for 3 months before I proposed. Everything felt right." He paused, his composure cracking slightly. Then I came home early one day in December. Found text messages on Dad's phone while he was in the shower. Explicit messages from my fiancé. The timeline clicked into place with horrible clarity. Daniel had discovered the affair in December, but proposed to Madison in November, which meant the betrayal had started almost immediately after they'd begun dating. Dad targeted her, Daniel continued, reading my thoughts. He met her first, actually, at that same conference. He introduced us, encouraged me to ask her out. I thought he was being supportive. Instead, he was setting up his own conquest. My husband had essentially given his mistress to our son as a bride. The cruelty of it was staggering. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, hurt layering over the shock and anger. Daniel moved back to his chair, sitting heavily. "Because I needed you to react authentically today. If you'd known, you might have tipped him off. Robert's smart, Mom. He's been covering his tracks carefully. The only reason I found the financial fraud was because I have forensic accountants working at my firm who owed me favors. They've been building a case quietly since January." He pulled a thick manila folder from inside his suit jacket. He'd been carrying evidence to his own wedding. "This contains documentation of $2.8 million in theft over 3 years. Bank statements, forged signatures, everything. The offshore accounts are in the Cayman Islands, set up under shell corporations." I took the folder with shaking hands, flipping through page after page of bank transfers, invoices, and highlighted ledger entries. My signature appeared on documents I'd never seen before. Robert had been forging my name, implicating me in his crimes while stealing from both our accounts. "The police?" I asked. Daniel shook his head. "Not yet. That's why today has to happen exactly as planned. In 30 minutes, Madison is going to walk down that aisle. Dad is going to stand beside me as my best man, just like we rehearsed. You're going to sit in the front row and smile. And when the minister asks if anyone objects to this union, that's when everything changes." He checked his watch, a Rolex his father had given him for his law school graduation. "We have 27 minutes. I need you to trust me, Mom." Trust felt like an impossible ask when my entire reality had shattered in the span of 10 minutes. But Daniel was my son. I'd raised him to be honest, strategic, and just. If he said this was necessary, I had to believe him. "What happens after someone objects?" I asked. "Who's going to object?" Daniel's smile was cold and didn't reach his eyes. "Madison is. She doesn't know it yet, but she's about to confess everything in front of 200 witnesses, including 3 family court judges, the district attorney, and a private investigator I hired who's seated in the back row with recording equipment. Everything she says will be documented and admissible in court." The precision of his plan was both impressive and terrifying. My son had turned his own wedding into a trap, using his father's mistress as the bait. The magnitude of Daniel's strategy began crystallizing in my mind. He hadn't just discovered betrayal. He'd weaponized it. "How will you get Madison to confess?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Daniel reached into his other jacket pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder. "This is a copy. The original is with my attorney. Last night at the rehearsal dinner, I had a private conversation with Madison in the hotel hallway. I told her I knew everything about her and Dad. I gave her a choice: confess today during the ceremony or face criminal conspiracy charges for helping Dad steal from the business." My confusion must have shown because he continued. "Madison isn't just Dad's mistress. She's been actively helping him. She works in accounting at Henderson Financial, where Dad banks his offshore money. She's the one who helped set up the shell corporations." The betrayal went even deeper than I'd imagined. Madison wasn't simply sleeping with my husband. She was his accomplice in theft. "So she agreed to confess?" I asked. Daniel nodded. "She thinks if she publicly admits to the affair and her role in the financial crimes, I'll argue for leniency with the prosecutor. She believes she's trading public humiliation for avoiding prison time. What she doesn't know is that the DA already has enough evidence to prosecute her independently. Her confession today will just make the case bulletproof." My son had become someone I barely recognized: calculating, ruthless, patient. But Robert had made him this way. My husband's betrayal had forced our son to dismantle his own happiness to achieve justice. "And your father?" I asked quietly. "When does he find out he's been caught?" "He'll figure it out about 30 seconds after Madison starts talking," Daniel said. The moment she mentions the offshore accounts, he'll know everything's over. That's when I need you to do something very specific, Mom. He leaned forward again, his voice dropping low. When Dad tries to leave, and he will try to leave, I need you to block his path. Stand up, walk into the aisle, and don't let him pass. Make a scene if you have to. The private investigator will be filming everything, and I need footage of Dad attempting to flee after the confession. It establishes consciousness of guilt. He was asking me to publicly confront the man I'd spent nearly 3 decades with, to physically prevent his escape, while 200 people watched. I can do that, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. Daniel's expression softened slightly. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you sooner, and I'm sorry you had to see what you saw in the bride's room. I know this isn't how you wanted to spend today. Tears finally came, hot and angry, streaming down my carefully made-up face. My makeup artist had spent 90 minutes on my face this morning, blending foundation and setting powder to create the picture of the proud mother of the groom. Now mascara probably streaked my cheeks in dark rivers. I thought I knew him, I said, my voice breaking. 28 years, Daniel. We built everything together. How could I not see what he was doing? My son moved to kneel beside my chair, taking my hands in his. Because he's a professional liar, Mom. This isn't your fault. None of it. A sharp knock on the door made us both jump. Daniel, your mother? Robert's voice filtered through the thick wood, concerned and smooth. Is everything all right? We need to start lining up. It's almost time. The sound of his voice, so familiar, so ordinary, sent ice through my veins. Daniel stood quickly, composing his features into a neutral expression. He looked at me with raised eyebrows, a silent question. Was I ready to do this? To walk back out there and pretend everything was normal while knowing what would unfold in less than 30 minutes? I wiped my face with tissues from the box on the desk, then stood on shaking legs. Coming, Robert, I called out, my voice remarkably steady. Just having a moment with our son before the ceremony. You know how emotional I get. I heard Robert chuckle on the other side of the door. Daniel squeezed my shoulder once, then unlocked the door. Robert stood in the hallway in his tuxedo, looking distinguished with his silver hair and confident smile. He'd always been handsome in that polished way that improved with age. Women at the country club still flirted with him. Now I understood why he'd been so receptive to their attention. There you are, Robert said warmly, reaching for my hand. You look beautiful, Claire. Are you ready for this? His touch made my skin crawl, but I forced myself not to flinch. Ready as I'll ever be, I replied, managing a watery smile that he would interpret as maternal emotion. Our baby's getting married. Robert turned to Daniel. And you, son. How are you holding up? Not getting cold feet, I hope? The casual cruelty of that question, asked by a man who'd been kissing the bride minutes earlier, almost broke my composure. Daniel's expression remained perfectly neutral. No cold feet, Dad. Everything is exactly as it should be. This day has been a long time coming. The double meaning sailed right past Robert, who clapped Daniel on the shoulder. That's my boy. Madison's a lucky woman. You're going to have a great life together. The lies flowed from him so easily, so naturally. I wondered how many other lies I'd believed over the years. How many late-night work sessions had actually been assignations? How many business trips had included side adventures? Daniel checked his watch again. We should get into position. The photographer wants to capture everyone walking in. He looked at me meaningfully. Mom, you'll be seated in exactly 18 minutes. Stay strong. Robert didn't seem to notice the odd phrasing. He was already moving down the hallway toward the sanctuary. I made my way to the church's front entrance where my escort was waiting, Robert's brother Greg, who had flown in from Seattle. Greg was a decent man, a high school history teacher with kind eyes and a gentle manner. He had no idea what was about to happen. Claire, you look lovely, Greg said, offering his arm. Nervous? I took his arm, grateful for the stability. You have no idea. The church doors opened and the processional music began. 200 faces turned to watch as we walked down the aisle. I recognized neighbors, business associates, family friends I'd known for years. The Hendersons sat 3 rows back, Jack and Martha, who'd celebrated New Year's Eve with us for the past decade. The Chens were there, alongside the Pattersons and the Williamson family. All these people had come to celebrate what they believed was a joyful union. The sanctuary was decorated with white roses and pale blue hydrangeas, my favorite flowers. Candles flickered in tall silver holders along each row. The afternoon sun streamed through stained glass windows, casting colored patterns across the white runner beneath my feet. Everything was beautiful, perfect, exactly as I'd envisioned when Madison and I planned these details together 4 months ago. We'd spent hours selecting flower arrangements and debating ribbon colors. She'd called me Mom and squeezed my hand when discussing how much this day meant to her. Every smile had been a lie. Greg deposited me in the front row, first seat on the bride's side. I sat carefully, smoothing my lavender dress beneath me. Across the aisle, Robert stood beside Daniel at the altar. My husband caught my eye and winked, his expression warm and loving. The bridesmaids processed down the aisle in their pale blue gowns. Madison's sister Sarah, her college roommate Jennifer, and Daniel's cousin Rachel. Each carried small bouquets of white roses. They took their positions on the left side of the altar, smiling brightly. Then the music changed, shifting to Wagner's traditional bridal chorus. Everyone stood. Madison appeared at the entrance, her arm linked through her father's. Her dress was stunning, ivory satin with delicate lace sleeves and a cathedral train that seemed to float behind her as she walked. The veil obscured her face slightly, but I could see her eyes scanning the crowd, probably searching for me. What had she thought when I'd walked in and caught her kissing Robert? Had she felt even a moment of guilt? Or had she immediately calculated her next move? Madison and her father reached the altar. The minister, Reverend Patricia Coleman, smiled warmly at the gathered crowd. She was a woman in her late 50s who'd known Daniel since he was a child. "Please be seated," she said, her voice carrying easily through the sanctuary's acoustics. The crowd settled with a rustle of fabric and creaking pews. Reverend Coleman opened her worn Bible, her reading glasses perched on her nose. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to join Daniel Christopher Morrison and Madison Elizabeth Hartley in holy matrimony. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, but reverently, deliberately, and in accordance with the purposes for which it was instituted by God." The traditional words felt obscene in the context of what was really happening. This wasn't a wedding, it was an execution. The Reverend continued through the opening remarks, discussing the sanctity of marriage vows and the commitment required to build a lasting union. I watched Robert out of the corner of my eye. He stood straight and proud, the picture of the supportive father. No hint of guilt shadowed his features. How had he managed to compartmentalize so completely? The Reverend reached the critical moment. "If any person here present knows of any lawful impediment to this marriage, let them speak now or forever hold their peace." The traditional pause felt eternal. In a normal wedding, this moment was purely ceremonial. No one ever actually objected. But today, the silence stretched and stretched. Madison shifted slightly, her bouquet trembling in her hands. Then she spoke, her voice clear and strong. "I do. I object." A collective gasp rippled through the sanctuary. The Reverend looked startled. "I'm sorry, did you—" "I object to this marriage," Madison repeated, louder this time. She turned to face the crowd, her veil falling back to reveal her face fully. Tears streamed down her cheeks, smudging her makeup. "I can't do this. I can't marry Daniel when I've been lying to him for months." The gasps turned to confused murmurs. People leaned toward each other, whispering frantically. Martha Henderson's hand flew to her mouth. Jack Chen half rose from his pew before his wife pulled him back down. The Reverend's face had gone pale. "Madison, dear, perhaps we should discuss this privately." But Madison was already speaking again, words tumbling out in a rush. "I've been having an affair with Daniel's father, Robert Morrison. We've been sleeping together since December. But that's not all." Her voice grew stronger, more desperate. "I helped Robert steal money from his business. He asked me to set up offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands because I work in financial services and have access to international banking systems. I created 3 shell corporations: Riverside Holdings, Clearwater Consulting, and Summit Advisory Partners. We funneled $2.8 million through those accounts over 3 years, embezzling from the business Robert owns with his wife, Claire." The sanctuary erupted. People were shouting now, standing, pointing. Someone was crying. The Reverend stumbled backward, nearly knocking over the flower arrangement behind her. I turned to look at Robert. His face had drained of all color. His eyes darted toward the exits, calculating distances and obstacles. This was the moment Daniel had predicted. Robert took a step back from the altar. I stood up and moved into the center aisle, blocking his path. Our eyes met across 10 feet of white runner, and I saw the exact moment he understood that I knew everything. "Claire," he said, his voice taking on that reasonable, persuasive tone he used to close business deals. "Claire, let's talk about this privately. This is a misunderstanding." I stayed where I was, my hands clenched at my sides. "The only misunderstanding was mine, Robert. I misunderstood who I married." He took another step toward me, his hand outstretched. 28 years, Claire. That has to count for something. Whatever she said, it's not what you think. Behind him, Daniel moved quietly to block the other side exit. The private investigator I didn't know by sight was presumably capturing everything. The 3 family court judges Daniel had mentioned were somewhere in this crowd, witnessing every word. "Stop," I said firmly. "Don't take another step." Robert froze, his expression shifting from pleading to calculating to angry in rapid succession. The mask was finally slipping. "You stupid woman," he hissed, low enough that only I could hear. "Do you have any idea what you're throwing away? I built everything we have. You were just along for the ride." There was the real Robert, the one I'd never seen before. Madison was still talking at the altar, her confession pouring out in greater detail. She named specific transactions, dates, account numbers she'd helped establish. Someone in the crowd was on their phone, probably calling the police. The district attorney Daniel had mentioned stood up from his seat in the middle section, his face stern. "Robert Morrison," he called out in a voice accustomed to courtrooms, "I advise you to remain exactly where you are." Robert's eyes went wild, darting around the sanctuary like a trapped animal. He lunged forward, trying to push past me. I didn't move. He grabbed my shoulders, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "Move, Claire. Get out of my way." Greg appeared at my side, pulling Robert's hands off me. "That's enough, Rob. Whatever's happening here, you're not going to hurt Claire." Other men from the congregation moved forward. Jack Henderson, Tom Patterson, Daniel's friend Marcus from law school. They formed a loose circle around Robert, not touching him but making escape impossible. The private investigator, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, stood near the back with his camera clearly visible now, still recording. Everything was documented. Daniel descended from the altar and walked toward us, his expression unreadable. He stopped beside me, facing his father. "It's over, Dad," Daniel said quietly. "Every account, every transaction, every lie, we have it all. The DA has enough evidence to prosecute both you and Madison for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. The forensic accountants have traced every dollar." Robert stared at his son with naked hatred. "You did this. You set me up." Daniel didn't deny it. "You made it necessary. You stole from your own family, from the business Mom helped you build. You targeted my fiancé to get to me, to hurt me. Did you think there wouldn't be consequences?" The sanctuary had gone completely silent now. 200 people were watching our family implode in real time, bearing witness to decades of lies crumbling into truth. Madison sank to her knees at the altar, still crying. The Reverend stood frozen, her Bible clutched to her chest. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Someone had definitely called them, and they were responding with impressive speed. Daniel must have warned them this might happen, prepared them to be nearby. The level of planning my son had executed was staggering. He'd orchestrated every element with precision, anticipating every possible move. Robert seemed to realize escape was impossible. His shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. "Claire," he said, looking at me one last time, "I never meant—" "Don't," I interrupted. "Whatever you're about to say, don't. You meant every bit of it. You chose this path over and over again, every time you forged my signature, every time you kissed her, every time you smiled at me over breakfast and pretended everything was fine." My voice broke on the last word, but I didn't care. The police entered through the main doors, 4 officers in uniform, their hands resting on their belts. The lead officer, a woman with sergeant stripes, surveyed the scene with professional calm. Someone want to tell me what's going on here? The district attorney stepped forward, presenting his identification. Sergeant, I'm DA Philip Warren. We have 2 individuals here who need to be taken into custody for questioning regarding embezzlement and conspiracy charges. Robert Morrison and Madison Hartley. We have documented confessions and substantial evidence. The sergeant nodded to her officers, who moved forward with handcuffs. Robert didn't resist as they cuffed his wrists behind his back and read him his rights. Madison was still on the floor, sobbing so hard she could barely stand. They had to support her as they cuffed her and helped her to her feet. As the police led them past me down the aisle, Robert stopped for just a moment. The officers allowed it, perhaps sensing this was a final goodbye. I did love you once, he said softly, before the money mattered more than everything else. I looked at the man I'd married, seeing a stranger in his place. I don't think you ever loved anyone but yourself, Robert. I just didn't see it until today. They led him away. Madison followed, her white dress trailing behind her like a broken promise. The sanctuary doors closed behind them with a heavy thud. In the sudden silence, 200 people sat in shocked stillness, processing what they'd witnessed. Daniel turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying clearly. I apologize that you all traveled here to witness a wedding and instead saw this. His composure was remarkable, speaking to a church full of confused guests, as if presenting a closing argument in court. Everything you heard today is true. My father and my fiancé were not only having an affair, but also conspiring to steal from my family's business. I discovered this 6 months ago and have been working with authorities to build a case. I needed documented confessions, which is why this had to happen publicly, today, with witnesses. He paused, his professional mask cracking slightly. I know this is unconventional and probably traumatic for many of you. I'm deeply sorry for that, but I couldn't let them continue hurting my mother, destroying the business she helped build, and betraying everyone who trusted them. Martha Henderson stood up from her pew. Daniel, honey, you don't owe us any apologies. Your father does. Others nodded in agreement. Tom Patterson called out, You did the right thing, son. Took real courage. The support from people who just had their Saturday afternoon hijacked by family drama was surprising and touching. These were good people, I realized, genuine friends who were already rallying around us rather than fleeing from the scandal. The Reverend finally found her voice. Perhaps we should all take a moment to pray, she suggested, her tone gentle but shaken. This is a lot to process. Daniel shook his head. Thank you, Reverend Coleman, but I think people just want to go home. We'll handle the business of canceling the reception and notifying the caterers. He looked around at the assembled guests. Thank you all for coming. I'm sorry the day ended this way. People began standing, gathering their belongings, murmuring to each other as they filed out. As the sanctuary slowly emptied, I sank back into the front pew. My legs had finally given out completely. The adrenaline that had carried me through the last hour was evaporating, leaving behind bone-deep exhaustion. Daniel sat beside me, and for the first time since this nightmare began, he looked young and vulnerable. Are you okay, Mom? He asked quietly. I wanted to lie, to be strong for him, but couldn't manage it. No, but I will be. He put his arm around me, and I leaned into my son, grateful for his solid presence. What happens now? I asked. Daniel sighed. Criminal proceedings. The DA will formally charge them both. Based on the amounts involved and the evidence, they'll likely face significant prison time. Dad's looking at 5 to 7 years minimum for the embezzlement alone, possibly more with the fraud charges. And Madison? I asked, surprised I could still feel any curiosity about her fate. Probably 3 to 5 years, Daniel replied. She's cooperating, which will help her, but she was actively involved in setting up the financial infrastructure. That's not a small role. I thought about the young woman I'd welcomed into our family, the one who'd called me Mom and held my hand while discussing wedding flowers. Had any of it been real, or had she been calculating all along? Did she ever care about you at all? I asked. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. I don't know. Maybe at first, but my father's very persuasive, and he had money to offer. I think she got caught up in something she didn't fully understand until it was too late. He didn't sound bitter, just tired and sad. Greg reappeared at the end of our pew. Robert's brother looked shell-shocked, his kind face drawn with grief. Claire. Daniel, I don't even know what to say. I had no idea Rob was capable of any of this. He sat down heavily on Daniel's other side. Is there anything I can do? Daniel shook his head. Just be here, Uncle Greg. That's enough. We sat together in the empty sanctuary as afternoon light continued streaming through stained glass windows, casting red and blue patterns across abandoned programs and scattered rose petals. The church smelled of flowers and candle wax and the lingering perfume of 200 guests. It should have been the setting for a beautiful celebration. Instead, it was a crime scene. My phone buzzed in my clutch. I'd silenced it before the ceremony, but it was on vibrate. I pulled it out to see a text from my sister Joan, who lived in Phoenix and hadn't been able to attend. Just saw something on social media about police at Daniel's wedding? What's happening? Call me. News was already spreading. By tomorrow, this would be all over town. The business, my reputation, Daniel's career, everything would be touched by scandal. I showed the text to Daniel, who grimaced. We should probably get ahead of this, he said. I'll draft a statement for the press. Keep it factual, brief, emphasize that justice is being served. Always the lawyer, already thinking 3 steps ahead. I was grateful for his strategic mind, even as I mourned the innocence he'd lost. No son should have to trap his own father. Greg spoke up. You'll both stay with me until things settle down. I'm not taking no for an answer. His offer was generous, but impossible. Greg, you live in Seattle. I have a business to run here, and Daniel has his practice. Greg gave me a look that reminded me suddenly of Robert before everything went wrong. The same determined set to his jaw, the same unwillingness to accept defeat. But unlike Robert, Greg wielded his stubbornness in service of others. Then I'm staying here. I'll take a leave from school. You're going to need family, real family, and I'm it. My brother destroyed enough. I'm not letting him destroy you two as well. Tears came again, but these were different. Gratitude mixed with grief. Thank you, I managed to say. Daniel stood, helping me to my feet. We should go to the police station. They'll want formal statements from us. The sooner we get that done, the sooner this part is over. The church was completely empty now except for the 3 of us. Even the Reverend had retreated to her office, probably trying to process what had happened in her sanctuary. We walked down the aisle together, past the abandoned altar and the flower arrangements that had cost $4,000. As we reached the doors, I turned back for one last look. This morning, I'd imagined watching my son marry here, celebrating with family and friends, dancing at the reception. Instead, I was leaving alone with my son and brother-in-law, heading to a police station to give statements about crimes committed by the man I'd shared my life with. The contrast was so stark, it almost made me laugh. Almost. The June sunshine outside felt jarring after the church's dim interior. Reality continued, despite personal catastrophe. We climbed into Greg's rental car, and he drove us to the downtown police station, a squat brick building I'd passed hundreds of times without ever entering. Inside, the building smelled of coffee and industrial cleaner. A desk sergeant took our names and directed us to wait. We sat in uncomfortable plastic chairs and waited to tell our story to people who dealt with betrayal professionally, who wouldn't be shocked by any of it. 20 minutes later, a detective named Harrison called us back to an interview room. She was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a professional demeanor. She recorded our statements separately, starting with Daniel. His interview took 90 minutes. When he emerged, he looked drained. "Your turn, Mom," he said quietly. I followed Detective Harrison into the small room with its metal table and worn chairs. She was kind but thorough, asking me to recount everything I'd seen. Everything Daniel had told me, every detail I could remember about the financial arrangements of our business. I told her about walking in on Robert and Madison, about the shock, about seeing the evidence in Daniel's folder. I told her about Robert trying to flee, about blocking his path, about the hatred in his eyes when the mask finally fell. It took 2 hours to get through everything. When I finally emerged, Daniel and Greg were still waiting. Daniel looked up from his phone. The story's already hitting local news sites, and someone posted video of the confession on social media. It's going viral. Of course it was. 200 people with smartphones had witnessed the whole thing. We'd be everywhere by morning, probably with headlines like "Wedding Turns Courtroom Drama" or "Groom Exposes Father at Altar." We left the police station as evening fell, the sky turning deep purple and orange over the city skyline. Greg drove us to my house, the house I'd shared with Robert for 15 years, the house we'd bought when his business finally took off. It felt strange walking through the front door, knowing he wouldn't come home tonight or perhaps ever again. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it this morning. My coffee cup still in the sink, the living room pillows arranged just so, Robert's reading glasses on the side table. The normalcy of it felt obscene. Daniel and Greg followed me inside. Greg immediately went to the kitchen, announcing he was making dinner. Daniel helped me out of my heels, which I'd been wearing for nearly 8 hours. My feet ached. We sat in the living room, neither of us speaking. The silence felt heavy with everything we weren't saying. The grief, the anger, the relief that it was finally over. My phone rang, shattering the quiet. Joan's name flashed on the screen. I answered. "Hey sis." Joan's voice came through frantic with worry. "Claire, what the hell happened? I'm seeing videos online of Robert being arrested at the wedding. Tell me this is some kind of horrible mistake." I took a deep breath and gave her the abbreviated version. The affair, the embezzlement, Daniel's plan, the confession, the arrests. Joan listened in stunned silence, occasionally gasping or swearing. When I finished, she said, "I'm booking a flight. I'll be there tomorrow morning." More family circling the wagons. I was grateful for it even as part of me wanted to hide from everyone, to process this privately without witnesses. But that wasn't possible anymore. Privacy had evaporated the moment Madison started confessing in front of 200 people. Joan and I talked for another 20 minutes before she had to go book her flight. By the time we hung up, Greg had dinner ready, pasta with marinara sauce, simple comfort food. We ate at the kitchen table, the three of us picking at our food more than actually eating. None of us had much appetite. Greg tried to make conversation about his students, about Seattle weather, about anything but today's events. Daniel checked his phone periodically, monitoring the spreading news coverage. "The business partners are calling," he said at one point, showing me a stream of texts on his screen. "Everyone wants to know what happens to the company now." That was a good question. Robert owned 51% of the business. I owned 30%, and there were 2 other partners who each held just under 10%. With Robert going to prison, control would shift. Daniel had already thought about it. "I spoke with the other partners last month," Daniel said, setting down his fork. "When I knew this was coming. They've agreed to support restructuring the ownership. With Dad's shares in limbo during the criminal proceedings, you'll assume operational control as majority stakeholder. I've drafted the paperwork already. It just needs signatures." My son had anticipated every contingency, planned for every possible outcome. "What about Robert's clients?" I asked. "Some of them have worked with him for 20 years. They might not want to stay with the firm after this," Greg interjected gently. "Or they might respect that you're cleaning house and doing the right thing. People value integrity, Claire. You've always had that. Robert's crimes don't diminish what you built." He was right, though it was hard to see past the immediate scandal to any potential future. We finished dinner in relative silence, then Greg insisted on cleaning up while Daniel and I moved to the living room. The evening news was starting, and Daniel turned on the television. Sure enough, our story was the lead segment. "Breaking news tonight from what was supposed to be a joyful wedding ceremony, but turned into a dramatic confession of fraud and infidelity," the anchor announced, her expression appropriately serious. They showed footage someone had taken. Madison at the altar, her confession spilling out, the shocked faces of guests. They showed Robert being led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of fury. The coverage was remarkably detailed for something that had happened only hours ago. The reporter noted the amounts involved, the offshore accounts, the affair. They mentioned Daniel by name, calling him a corporate attorney who had orchestrated an elaborate sting operation to expose his own father's crimes. Daniel's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and grimaced. "It's the senior partner at my firm," he said, standing and walking into the hallway for privacy. I could hear his voice through the wall, calm and professional, explaining the situation. When he returned 15 minutes later, his expression was carefully neutral. "They're putting me on administrative leave pending an internal review, standard procedure when an attorney is involved in anything that generates this much publicity. It's not disciplinary. They were actually impressed by how I handled the evidence gathering. But they need to make sure everything was done properly, that I didn't violate any ethical guidelines." Another consequence rippling outward from Robert's actions. Daniel's career wasn't destroyed, but it would be affected, examined, questioned. "I'm sorry," I said, though the apology felt inadequate. Daniel shook his head. "Don't be. I knew this would happen. It's a small price to pay for justice." But it wasn't small. None of this was small. We'd lost husband and father, watched a wedding transform into an arrest, and become the center of a media circus that would follow us for months. The doorbell rang, making us all jump. Greg went to answer it, returning a moment later with Detective Harrison. "I apologize for the late visit," she said, declining the offer to sit. "I wanted to update you in person rather than over the phone. Robert Morrison and Madison Hartley have both been formally charged. He's being held on $2 million bail, which he'll have difficulty posting since we've frozen his accounts. She's on $500,000 bail, and her family is trying to arrange it." She paused, consulting a small notebook. "The DA will be prosecuting both cases aggressively. Given the amounts involved and the documented evidence, he's confident about conviction." I absorbed this information with a strange numbness. Robert was in jail tonight, sleeping on a hard cot instead of our king-sized bed with its expensive memory foam mattress. He'd always been particular about comfort, complaining if the thermostat was set wrong or his coffee wasn't hot enough. How would he handle incarceration? Detective Harrison continued. "We'll need you both to be available for depositions and potentially testimony. The trial probably won't happen for 6 to 8 months. These financial cases take time to prepare. Is there anything else you need from us right now?" Daniel spoke up. "Have they said anything? Robert or Madison? Have they made any statements beyond what happened at the church?" Harrison's expression hardened slightly. "Mr. Morrison has invoked his right to counsel and isn't speaking with us. Ms. Hartley is cooperating fully, providing details about the offshore accounts and the timeline of the affair." Of course Madison was cooperating. Daniel had promised her consideration if she did. She was probably hoping to reduce her sentence, to salvage something from the wreckage. After Harrison left, Greg suggested we all try to sleep. It was nearly 10 o'clock, and exhaustion was written across all our faces. Daniel agreed to stay the night in his old bedroom, the one we'd kept mostly unchanged since he'd moved out years ago. Greg took the guest room. I climbed the stairs to the master bedroom, that space I'd shared with Robert for so long, and stood in the doorway looking at the king-sized bed. I couldn't sleep there tonight. Couldn't lie where he'd lain, in sheets he'd touched. Instead, I grabbed a pillow and blanket and made my way back downstairs to the living room couch. I must have eventually slept because I woke to sunlight streaming through the windows. The smell of coffee drew me to the kitchen, where Greg was making breakfast, and Daniel sat at the table with his laptop open, already working despite it being barely 7 in the morning. "Morning, Mom," Daniel said, glancing up. Joan texted. "Her flight lands at 9:30. I said I'd pick her up." I poured coffee, grateful for the mundane routine of it. The morning news played quietly on the kitchen television, and inevitably our story came up again. More footage from yesterday, now with added commentary from legal experts discussing the case. One lawyer noted that cases involving this level of documented evidence rarely went to trial. Defendants usually accepted plea deals rather than face juries. Another expert commented on Daniel's decision to stage the confrontation publicly, debating the ethics of using a wedding ceremony as a venue. Opinions seemed divided on whether his actions were brilliantly strategic or unnecessarily cruel. I didn't have the energy to care what strangers thought about my son's choices. He'd done what he had to do to protect his family and seek justice. Joan arrived mid-morning, bursting through the front door with her suitcase and immediately wrapping me in a fierce hug. My sister was 2 years younger than me, a high school principal with a no-nonsense attitude and fierce loyalty. "I'm here," she announced. "I took 2 weeks off work. We're going to get through this together." Her certainty was comforting even if I didn't share it. The days that followed blurred together into a haze of meetings with lawyers, accountants, and business partners. Daniel's attorney confirmed that everything had been handled legally, the evidence gathering, the recording, the staged confrontation. There would be no issues with admissibility in court. The forensic accountants walked me through the full extent of Robert's theft. $2.8 million over 3 years, but the damage went deeper than the raw numbers. He'd damaged client relationships by billing for work never completed. He'd put the entire company at legal risk with his forged signatures and fraudulent documentation. Several clients had already left once news of the arrests broke, unwilling to be associated with scandal. But others stayed, expressing support and confidence in the business under my leadership. Our largest client, Patterson Manufacturing, sent a formal letter stating they believed in the company's integrity and looked forward to continuing the relationship. Tom Patterson called personally to reiterate his support. "You didn't do this, Claire," he said firmly. "You're the victim here. Anyone who can't see that isn't worth your time." The restructuring paperwork Daniel had prepared moved forward quickly. The other partners signed off, and by the end of the second week, I officially held operational control. Robert's shares were in a trust pending the outcome of his criminal case. If convicted, when convicted really, given the evidence, those shares would be liquidated to help pay restitution. I'd have the option to purchase them at fair market value. Joan stayed the full 2 weeks, helping me sort through the practical matters of separating my life from Robert's. We divided bank accounts, changed passwords, met with a divorce attorney to begin those proceedings. Missouri law required a 30-day waiting period after filing, which meant our marriage wouldn't officially end until mid-July. But the paperwork set everything in motion. I moved Robert's belongings into the garage. Clothes, books, personal items. Everything he'd left behind when police took him away. Touching his things felt surreal, like packing up a stranger's life. Joan helped me bag shirts I'd washed hundreds of times, shoes I'd seen by the door every day. We found his journal in his nightstand drawer, leather-bound and filled with his distinctive cramped handwriting. I opened it despite knowing I shouldn't, despite knowing it would only hurt. The entries were sporadic, spanning the last 2 years. Most were mundane observations about business deals or golf games, but scattered throughout were entries about Madison. "She understands ambition in a way Claire never did," he'd written in March. "Claire's content with enough. Madison wants more, just like me. Together, we could build something truly impressive." Further back, an entry from December made my stomach turn. "Introduce Daniel to Madison today. He's smitten. This could work perfectly. Keep her close. Keep him distracted. I'm probably going to hell, but at least I'll go there rich." He'd planned it all from the start. The relationship between Daniel and Madison hadn't been an unexpected complication. It had been part of Robert's design. I showed the journal to Daniel, who read the relevant passages with a clenched jaw. "He really did target both of us deliberately," Daniel said quietly. "This wasn't just about money or lust. He enjoyed the manipulation." Joan took the journal from him. "This goes to the prosecutors. It's more evidence of premeditation and consciousness of guilt. He knew what he was doing was wrong and did it anyway." She was right. We added it to the growing pile of documentation that would be used against Robert at trial. In late June, nearly a month after the disastrous wedding, we received word that Robert's attorney was negotiating a plea deal. He would plead guilty to all charges in exchange for a sentence of 7 years with possibility of parole after 5. Madison's deal was being finalized simultaneously, 4 years with parole eligibility after 2.5. The DA's office asked if we wanted to provide victim impact statements before the sentencing hearing. Daniel declined, saying the evidence spoke for itself, but I decided to write one. I needed to articulate the damage Robert had caused, not just financially, but emotionally, to our family and to the business we'd built together. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for July 15th, 6 weeks after the wedding that never happened. On that warm summer morning, I dressed carefully in a navy blue suit and drove downtown to the courthouse with Daniel, Joan, and Greg. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that cast everything in harsh brightness. Robert was already seated at the defense table with his attorney, wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of the expensive suits I was used to seeing him in. He'd lost weight, and his face looked drawn and older. When I entered, he turned to look at me. Our eyes met for a brief moment before I looked away. There was nothing left to say to him that mattered. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Judge Patricia Brennan, called the court to order. The proceedings moved through formalities: confirmation of the plea agreement, review of charges, verification that Robert understood what he was agreeing to. Then it was time for victim impact statements. The DA nodded to me, and I stood on shaking legs. I'd practiced this speech a dozen times, but actually delivering it in front of Robert, in front of the court, made my voice tremble. "Your Honor," I began, reading from the paper I'd prepared. "Robert Morrison was my husband for 28 years. We built a business together from nothing. I trusted him completely with our finances, our future, our family." I looked up from the paper, making myself continue. "He violated that trust in every way possible. He stole money that we'd earned together, forged my signature on documents, implicated me in his crimes without my knowledge. He had an affair with our son's fiancée, deliberately introducing them as part of his scheme. He destroyed our son's relationship and wedding day. The financial damage totals $2.8 million, but the emotional damage is incalculable." My voice strengthened as I continued. "I helped him start his business in 1997. I managed the books in our basement while caring for our infant son. I gave up my own career opportunities to support his dreams. And he repaid that loyalty by stealing from me, lying to me, and attempting to destroy everything we built when he was caught." I paused, looking directly at Robert. "I don't forgive him, but I've stopped letting his actions define my future." The judge thanked me, and I sat down. Daniel squeezed my hand. The judge reviewed the plea agreement details, confirmed with both attorneys that everything was in order, then pronounced sentence. "Mr. Morrison, you are hereby sentenced to 7 years in the Missouri Department of Corrections on counts of embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. You will be eligible for parole review after 5 years served. You are also ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $2,800,000 to be paid through liquidation of assets and garnishment of any future earnings. Do you understand this sentence?" Robert stood slowly. "Yes, Your Honor." His voice was subdued, defeated. Madison's hearing followed immediately after. She looked even worse than Robert, pale and thin, her eyes red from crying. Her attorney presented her plea agreement. 4 years in prison, parole eligibility after 2.5 years, $800,000 in restitution. Judge Brennan was slightly less harsh with Madison, noting her cooperation and her relatively lesser role in organizing the scheme. But she still emphasized that Madison's actions had been serious crimes that warranted significant punishment. "You used your professional knowledge to facilitate theft, Ms. Hartley. That represents a profound betrayal of the trust placed in you by your employer and by the financial system. You will serve your sentence at the Chillicothe Correctional Center." Madison nodded mutely, tears streaming down her face. As the bailiffs led them both away to begin their sentences, I felt an unexpected emptiness. I'd thought I would feel satisfaction or vindication, but instead, I just felt tired. 28 years of my life had led to this moment. My husband being taken to prison, my son's ex-fiancée following behind him, both of them paying the price for their crimes. We left the courthouse and stood on the steps in the July sunshine. Reporters clustered at the bottom of the stairs, shouting questions, but Daniel had prepared a brief statement. He stepped forward and read from his phone. "Justice has been served today. Robert Morrison and Madison Hartley have been held accountable for their actions. Our family appreciates the professionalism of law enforcement and the district attorney's office. We're focused now on moving forward and rebuilding. We won't be taking questions." He stepped back, and we moved quickly to Greg's car before the reporters could surround us. The media attention had actually lessened over the past 6 weeks, as other scandals and news stories captured public attention. We were old news already, which was a relief. Back at the house, Joan made lunch while we all tried to decompress. The sentencing had felt simultaneously like an ending and a beginning. "What now?" Joan asked, as we sat around the kitchen table with sandwiches none of us were really eating. Daniel spoke first. "I go back to work. My administrative leave ends next week. I've got cases waiting and clients who need representation." Greg added, "I fly back to Seattle tomorrow. School starts in a month and I need to prep, but I'll be back for Thanksgiving if you'll have me." I smiled at my brother-in-law. "Of course, this is still your family, Greg. Robert's choices don't change that." Joan looked at me. "And you, sis? What's your plan?" I thought about the question, considering all the changes the past 6 weeks had brought. "I rebuild. The business is stable now. We've replaced the clients we lost, and the restructuring is complete. I hire a new CFO to handle the finances, someone with impeccable credentials and references. someone I can trust completely. I paused, thinking about the personal aspects. I sell this house. Too many memories here, and most of them are lies now. I find somewhere smaller, somewhere that's just mine. I file for divorce as soon as the waiting period ends. And I start figuring out who Claire Morrison is when she's not defined by being Robert's wife. It felt good to articulate these plans, to claim agency over my future. Joan reached across the table and squeezed my hand. You're going to be okay, more than okay. You're going to be great. Daniel nodded agreement. You've always been the strongest person I know, Mom. Dad's crimes don't change that. Over the following months, I executed the plan I'd laid out. The house sold in September to a young couple expecting their first child. They loved the big backyard and the updated kitchen. I didn't tell them about the scandal that had unfolded here. I purchased a townhouse in a quiet neighborhood across town, smaller and newer with no history attached to it. Moving into that space felt like shedding an old skin, stepping into a version of myself I'd never had the chance to explore. The business continued stabilizing under my leadership. I hired Janet Reeves as CFO, a woman with 20 years of experience in financial management and references from 3 former employers who spoke glowingly of her integrity. She implemented new oversight systems to prevent the kind of fraud Robert had perpetrated. We instituted quarterly audits, dual signature requirements on all large transactions, and transparent reporting to all partners. By December, the company was actually thriving. We'd landed 2 major new clients, and revenue projections for the coming year looked strong. The staff, initially shaken by Robert's crimes, had rallied around the new leadership and renewed focus on ethical practices. My divorce was finalized in October, a simple hearing where the judge approved the dissolution of our marriage based on irreconcilable differences, the legal euphemism for, my husband is a convicted felon serving 7 years for stealing from our business and sleeping with our son's fiancée. I left the courthouse single for the first time since 1997, and the freedom felt both terrifying and exhilarating. Daniel's career recovered from the administrative leave without lasting damage. If anything, the publicity had enhanced his reputation as someone willing to make hard choices to achieve justice. Several high-profile clients sought him out specifically because of how he'd handled the situation with Robert. He wasn't dating anyone and said he wasn't ready to think about relationships. I understood completely. Trust would take time to rebuild. Thanksgiving arrived, and true to his word, Greg flew in from Seattle. Joan came from Phoenix, and we celebrated at my new townhouse. It was a small gathering, just the 4 of us, but it felt right. We were family forged through crisis, stronger now for having survived it. As we sat around my new dining table, Greg raised his wine glass. To resilience, he said. To surviving the worst and coming out stronger. We clinked glasses and drank. The wine was a good vintage, something I'd splurged on because life was too short for bad wine and people who stole millions while pretending to love you. Daniel added his own toast. To Mom, who handled all of this with more grace than anyone should have to. Joan joined in. To Claire, who proved you can rebuild after everything falls apart. I felt tears prickling, but blinked them back. Thank you. All of you. I couldn't have survived this without you. It was true. Family, real family, the kind that showed up and stayed, had made all the difference. The months continued passing. I attended a support group for people whose spouses had committed financial crimes. I discovered I wasn't alone. There were others navigating the same confusion and anger and grief. We shared stories, strategies for moving forward, and the gradual rebuilding of trust in our own judgment. I took up watercolor painting, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for when managing the business and maintaining the illusion of a perfect marriage. My paintings were mediocre at best, but I didn't care. The process was meditative, and I loved watching colors bloom and blend on paper. In February, a year after Daniel had first discovered the affair and begun building his case, I received a letter from Robert. It had been forwarded through the DA's office. Apparently, prisoners weren't allowed to contact victims directly. The letter was 5 pages long, written in his familiar handwriting. I debated whether to read it or simply throw it away. Finally, I opened it and read. Robert's letter was part apology, part justification. He claimed he'd never meant to hurt anyone, that he'd gotten caught up in the pursuit of success and lost sight of what mattered. He said Madison had pursued him, not the other way around, which contradicted everything else, including his own journal entries. He insisted he'd always loved me, even while betraying me in every possible way. The letter asked for forgiveness, for understanding, for some acknowledgement that our 28 years together had meant something. I read it through twice, then walked to my kitchen and fed it to the garbage disposal. Some things didn't deserve response or acknowledgement. Forgiveness might come someday, but it wouldn't be delivered in a letter or phone call. It would be personal, internal, on my own timeline. Spring arrived with blooming flowers and warming temperatures. I celebrated my 54th birthday with Joan and Daniel, and we laughed for the first time in months. Genuine laughter, not the brittle kind that masks pain. Daniel had met someone new, a fellow attorney named Karen, who worked in family law. They'd been dating for 2 months, taking things slowly, building trust gradually. I liked her immediately. She was straightforward, intelligent, and clearly cared about my son. She knows everything, Daniel told me privately. The whole story about Dad and Madison and the wedding. I told her on our second date because I didn't want any secrets. She said she appreciated the honesty. I hugged him tightly. That's how you build something real, with truth from the beginning. He nodded. I learned from the best, Mom. You always told the truth, even when it hurt. In April, I received word that Robert was being transferred to a minimum security facility after good behavior. He'd serve the remainder of his sentence there, potentially becoming eligible for parole in another 4 years. Madison was at a different facility, and according to court records, she'd been a model prisoner, participating in educational programs and working in the prison library. I felt nothing about either update. No anger, no satisfaction, just neutral acknowledgement of information. They'd receded in importance, becoming footnotes to my story rather than the main narrative. The business celebrated its 25th anniversary in May. We held a party for staff and clients, and Tom Patterson gave a toast about resilience and integrity. Morrison Consulting has been through the fire and emerged stronger, he said. That's the mark of a truly excellent organization. Here's to 25 more years. I'd decided to keep the Morrison name for the business, despite everything. It represented the years of legitimate work I'd put into building the company, and I wouldn't let Robert's crimes erase that contribution. Plus, changing the name would have been expensive and complicated. Daniel accepted this reasoning, though he'd offered to help rebrand if I wanted to. By summer, a full year after that disastrous wedding day, I found myself in a place I'd never expected, genuinely content with my life. The business was thriving under my leadership. I developed friendships through the support group and my painting class. My townhouse felt like home in a way the old house never had. My family relationships were stronger, built on honesty rather than the careful maintenance of appearances. I still had bad days when anger or grief would surge unexpectedly. I'd catch a glimpse of someone who looked like Robert and feel my stomach drop. I'd hear a song we'd danced to at our wedding and remember how young and hopeful I'd been. But these moments grew less frequent and less intense as time passed. I was healing, slowly but genuinely. One evening in late June, I sat on my small patio with a glass of wine and my journal. I'd started keeping one myself, documenting this journey from devastation to renewal. I wrote about the year that had passed, about everything I'd lost and everything I'd gained. I'd lost a husband, but gained clarity about who I was independent of that relationship. I'd lost the illusion of a perfect marriage, but gained authentic connections with people who valued truth. I'd lost financial security briefly, but rebuilt it stronger than before on foundations I controlled. The balance sheet, while painful, wasn't entirely negative. As the sun set over my neighborhood, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I thought about that moment in the church 1 year ago when I'd opened a door expecting one thing and found something completely different. That moment had shattered my world, but the pieces had been rearranged into something new, something smaller perhaps, but more honest and ultimately more valuable. I'd survived the worst betrayal imaginable and discovered I was stronger than I'd ever known. My son had demonstrated incredible courage in exposing ugly truths to achieve justice. My family had rallied when it mattered most. And I'd learned that identity didn't depend on who you were married to or what others thought of you. It came from within, from choices made in crisis, from how you treated people when no one was watching. Robert's crimes had revealed not just his character, but mine, and I was proud of what I'd found. Resilience, integrity, the ability to rebuild. Those were things no one could steal or diminish. The business, the house, even the money, those were just external markers. What really mattered was internal, and I'd protected that core self even in the worst moments. The streetlights flickered on as darkness fell. Inside, my phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. "Dinner Friday? Karen wants to get to know you better." I smiled and typed back, "Absolutely. My place or restaurant?" His response came quickly. "Your place. Karen says your lasagna is legendary, and I might have bragged about it." I laughed and confirmed. Simple moments, simple pleasures, simple honesty. That's what life looked like now, and it was enough. More than enough. It was real. As I went inside and started thinking about what to serve alongside the requested lasagna, I realized I was looking forward to Friday with genuine anticipation. No dread, no anxiety about maintaining perfect appearances, just the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with people I loved and who loved me back without conditions or hidden agendas. That night, I slept soundly in my new bed in my new home. No nightmares about churches or confessions or betrayal. Just deep, restful sleep and dreams I didn't remember upon waking. The healing wasn't complete. Perhaps it never would be entirely. But it had progressed far enough that most days felt manageable, even good. I'd reclaimed my life from the wreckage Robert had created. I'd found strength in vulnerability, power in honesty, and peace in accepting that some questions would never have satisfying answers. Why had Robert done what he did? Why had he risked everything for money and an affair? Why had he hurt the people who loved him most? I'd never truly understand his reasoning because his values were fundamentally different from mine, and that was okay. I didn't need to understand him to move forward. I only needed to understand myself and what I valued. Integrity, family, honest work, genuine connection. Friday arrived, and Karen came to dinner with a bouquet of sunflowers and a warm smile. We ate lasagna and salad and garlic bread, drinking wine and talking about everything except scandals and crimes. Karen told funny stories about difficult clients and bizarre family law cases. Daniel contributed tales from his corporate practice. I shared updates about the business and my painting class. Normal conversation, normal life, normal evening among people who chose to be together rather than people trapped by obligation or deception. As they were leaving, Karen hugged me goodbye. "Thank you for welcoming me," she said quietly. "Daniel means the world to me, and meeting you helps me understand why he's such a good man." I held her a moment longer. "Take care of each other. Be honest, even when it's hard. That's the foundation of anything real." She nodded against my shoulder. "I promise." After they left, I cleaned up the dinner dishes, wiped down the counters, and settled into my favorite chair with the book I'd been reading. My life had become beautifully ordinary in the best possible way. No drama, no secrets, no betrayals lurking around corners. Just steady, honest days building into weeks and months and eventually years. The scandal that had consumed everything a year ago had faded into the past. Still part of my story, but no longer defining it. I was Claire Morrison, business owner, mother, sister, friend. And those identities had nothing to do with Robert or his crimes. They were mine alone, earned through survival and growth. Outside my window, summer evening sounds drifted in. Children playing in a nearby yard, a dog barking, someone starting a lawnmower despite the late hour. Life continuing in all its messy, beautiful ordinariness. I turned the page of my book and kept reading, content with exactly where I was. The pearl necklace I'd been holding that day in the church, the one I'd meant to give Madison, sat in my jewelry box upstairs. I'd kept it, deciding to give it eventually to any future grandchildren Daniel might have with someone worthy of the heirloom. It had been my grandmother's, passed to me on my wedding day, meant to symbolize tradition and continuity. Madison had never deserved it, and I was glad circumstances had prevented me from making that mistake. That necklace had been in my hand when my world shattered, a tiny detail in the enormous catastrophe. Now it waited for a future moment when I could pass it on with genuine joy rather than obligatory ceremony. Everything had changed in a single year, yet somehow I'd emerged intact. Wounded, certainly. Wiser, definitely. But intact and moving forward with clarity about who I was and what I valued. Robert had stolen millions and years and trust, but he hadn't destroyed me. That resilience was mine to keep forever.